Hello and welcome. I am Claire Mishkat,
I'm Natasha Wilkerson.
and we are co-founders of Vivify STEM. We are a curriculum resource company passionate about providing STEM curriculum and resources to educators.
Yeah, and so our background's actually in aerospace engineering. I started working as an engineer for the Department of Defense, working on satellites.
And I worked at Boeing Commercial Airplanes and Boeing Space Exploration, and most recently in the agricultural aviation industry.
Yeah, so we have this technical background, but as we were working as engineers, we started working with students. And we just got really passionate about helping students connect what they're doing in the classroom with these real world jobs like we have. And that passion turned into our job now, which includes Vivify STEM. And so what we've learned in implementing STEM in our programs, you can do these different activities, but sometimes it helps bringing in a story.
Yeah, so a lot of the curriculum that you're teaching is hard for kids to digest if it's just so piecemeal, and being able to connect them through a story really makes it stick. So, Natasha, do you know how people used to navigate like way back in the day when they
With
would?
the stars.
Yeah, with the stars. That's
Yeah.
right. So, when they had to memorize this vast expanse of the universe that they stared at every night,
Right.
did they just stare at it and hope that it would just become ingrained in their mind?
I don't know.
So no, they didn't.
Oh.
They actually would tell stories. So they would talk about how the bear was being hunted by the great hunter Orion. And so as they were telling these stories, they were naming the constellations, and it would map out the sky for them. And because they were telling it in a storyline, then they were able to memorize
So
the
they got
sky.
hooked in, and it builds more of an emotional connection, right?
Right.
And so I can see that when we're doing an engineering design challenge, it might be a little dry and like, here's a constraint, some rules. But if you can connect it to a story, it helps the kids get invested.
It's engaging and memorable. And so I'm going to elaborate on that more and talk about how you can use storylines to engage kids in STEM.
Let's dive in.
In this presentation, I will give you an example of what it means to teach STEM in a storyline, then give you the blueprint to creating a story of your own, and finally offer some tips to ensure your STEM story success. Make sure you have a printed copy of the provided handout before we get started so you can take notes and have links to access free resources of content related to this course. In my example of how wayfinders memorize the stars through a story about the constellations, the story is what provided them the mental map and gave them the tools that they needed to memorize what they needed to know for their way of life. In the same way, you can create a story that will give your students a mental map and provide them the organizational tools they need to ultimately memorize what's important from your lessons. So let me start by giving you an example. In science, you may need to teach about forces in motion, while you also may need to teach about plants, what they need to grow and their parts. So I've done this with a story that I like to call the launch pad. And in this story, it's space themed and it's led by a fictional character named Astronaut Alex. I begin the story by telling them an overall mission. Your students are the astronauts, and Astronaut Alex, the commander, is giving your students the mission to go to the moon, build a base there, collect samples, and bring them back to Earth. Now, this is the overall mission of this story. It is the main storyline, and each lesson is given in a class period as a certain mission in this story. So let me continue with this example. So to get to the moon, they need to build a rocket. And this is how I start that lesson or that class period within the story. Astronaut Alex reads, "It's time to go to the moon, but the moon is really far away. We will need a rocket to help us travel over 230,000 miles. We need the help of engineers to design our rocket. How will you power the rocket? What is the best shape for a rocket? This mission requires critical thinking to succeed. Remember, before you start building, take the time to think carefully and plan your design. Best of luck, Astronaut Alex." Now in that lesson, your students, the astronauts, are asked to build a rocket as engineers. So in that lesson, we talk about forces in motion by talking about the forces on a rocket. We also incorporate math by talking about launch angles and distance calculations. Then we talk about the engineering design process, and use that to build straw rockets and launch them. Now, as we continue throughout our storyline in several class periods, we talk about landing on the moon, we talk about building a base on the moon, and then I'll continue this example with another lesson within the storyline. That class period starts off with astronaut Alex talking about how living on the moon, we need to eat. So how are we going to do that? He reads. He says, "How will we eat on the moon? Today, you will become botanists on a mission to grow plants on the moon. Plants need sunlight, water, and air to grow. This mission requires resilience to succeed. Be patient as you plan, build, and study your results." In this lesson, your students, the astronauts, learn about what plants need to grow. They learn the parts of a plant, and then they use the engineering design process to design a device that will grow plants on the moon. Now you can incorporate other things, including math. You talk about the growth of the plant. You can chart it and graph it. You can also incorporate current events. That's talking about current NASA technologies that are being used to learn how to grow plants into space. The neat thing about teaching through a storyline is that regardless of what standards or objectives you need to teach, you are able to incorporate them in an overall cohesive way. You can teach science, math, technology, engineering, history, current events, geography, really anything that you need to teach. It's easy for you to incorporate them and ultimately helps your students to log it into their long-term memory. Now that you know what I mean by teaching STEM through a storyline, I'm going to give you the blueprint to create a storyline of your own. The first thing that you need is a theme. In my example, the theme was space exploration. You can choose anything as your theme. That could be travel or a historical event or maybe even a favorite sport. Your theme is something that you're going to tie everything into and helps you create the context of your story. The second thing that you need is a leader. The leader is going to act as the narrator of your story. The leader can be you. You can have a certain character in your story that matches with your theme, or you can create a fictitious character like I did in my example with astronaut Alex. The third thing that you need is student roles. You want your students to be actively engaged in your storyline, so give them a role. This role can be a certain occupation, or your role can be something that they have to do on their trip, like maybe they are travelers on a trip to another country. Whatever it is, they need to be actively engaged and feel like they're a participant inside the story. The fourth thing that you need is an end goal. Now each lesson or each class period is going to have a specific mission, and we'll get to that in a minute, but it needs to tie into an overall end goal. In my example, the goal was to travel to the moon, build a base, and then bring back samples. That is what each mission is going to point to, or each lesson or class period is going to point to, but there needs to be an overall goal that is progressed towards each class period. Now you know what things that your storyline needs, but you may be thinking, well, how do I come up with that? Where do I start? Well, there's two ways that you can come up with what your theme of your storyline is going to be. The first way is you could list all of the standards and objectives that you need to teach, and you can look and see if any of those things tie together, or maybe they spark some sort of idea by looking at what things could be combined. Now, typically I think that is the more difficult way for me, so I like to do the second way, which is think of something that I am interested in or passionate about that may be easier for me to write about or talk about a theme. For example, I am really interested in space exploration myself, so I already know a lot about it and can speak more fluently about it and tie in things to it. And I also have a lot of props and things that I could do a classroom transformation about space exploration, so that theme was really natural for me. So you may be interested in a certain sport or have a background in a certain occupation or area or place of travel that may be easier for you to create a theme about. So next we're going to talk about each mission and how you plan the specific lessons within your storyline. Now let's talk about what each chapter of your story or lesson in your story needs. Now each lesson can be one class period or it can be multiple class periods, but I wouldn't go over 2 to 3 sessions or meetings because then you kind of lose momentum in your story and lose engagement. So each class period or a few, you'll have a different chapter in your story. And those chapters need a few things. First, you need a mission. And this is a mini goal. So it's not talking about your overall goal, like in my example, a mission to the moon, but it's a small goal within those. In my example, we need to grow food on the moon, and we also need to get to the moon using rockets. So those are two different chapters or lessons within the overall story. So your mission can be classified in two different ways that will help you build each mission or lesson. One is a we need scenario. So in my example, one of them was we need to eat while we're on the moon. So we talked about plants and how to grow them. In the other scenario is a oh no scenario. That means something broke or we have a problem we need to fix. That could be we need to get back to Earth, but our rocket broke. So we need to develop a new way to do it. So either a we need or an oh no scenario can lead into the other objectives that you need to teach. And you can incorporate your science objective by saying, well, before we learn how to grow plants, we need to know what plants need to grow. Or before we build a rocket ship, we need to know how rockets fly. So those two ways should get you going and being able to incorporate your science objectives and develop your mini goals or mini missions within your overall story. And there's one other thing that I recommend strongly that you include in every mission, and that is a STEM career. Now, when you list a STEM career, that helps students connect what you're learning in the classroom to what real-world STEM professionals do. What's great about teaching through a storyline is you're actually showing students how you use these things that you're teaching in the real world through this story, because it's probably going to have a lot of realistic elements to it. So when I talked about plants, I used botanists. If you've seen the movie The Martian, the main character in there was a botanist. So it's really easy for me to connect that to space exploration. And when I talked about rockets, I talked about aerospace engineers. So as you incorporate all these things into your mini missions or end goals into the chapter of your story, you'll be able to develop this connection that your students will remember. Now you have the blueprint and you're ready to create your first story. But first, here's a few more tips for you to consider. First, your story needs to remain pretty compact. So you may have 10 to 12 lessons. That's a good length that we have found within your story. If you go longer than that, you may lose momentum and your students may forget the total end goal and lose enthusiasm for their role in your story. So 10 to 12 lessons for one story, and you can choose to have multiple stories throughout the year. Second is your students may need more practice in teamwork and communication to be able to participate well in each lesson within your story. To do this, we recommend having icebreaker activities that you do throughout your storyline. They may need astronaut training, or maybe they need pirate training, and you can have them build the tallest tower out of cups to hold the mast of their pirate ship. Whatever it is, you can tie it into your theme and have multiple teamwork and communication developing activities within your story. Lastly, celebrate the end of your storyline. Your students are probably excited about achieving that final end goal, and so are you, I'm sure. So you can do things like play a review game. Maybe you play bingo to assess how they learned the concepts that you were teaching within your storyline. Maybe they are able to come and dress as a theme or have themed snacks during class. Whatever it is, you should celebrate the end of your story, and your kids are for sure going to be excited about the next one that you create.
Well, thanks for watching, and I hope you can take back some of the things that we've taught you today back to your classroom.
And if you want to learn more information, check the links out in the handouts that you were provided, and you can find us at vivifystem.com. We hope to hear from you soon.